The roster is set. The practice squad is set. It looks like the Vikings are ready to go into the season. So let's talk about some of the last things that they did and a little bit about what the new plan is going to be and the way that practice squad works. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast.
Ooh-wee! You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I am your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL. Show is on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Today, I want to talk to you about the practice squad, the total practice squad. And it's a little bit of a bottom roster thing, but it's a bottom roster kind of day. So there's a few things to go over here. One, the actual players and which ones we actually care about, and why we will care about those players will be because a lot more of these guys are going to be active in games than maybe we think. And I'll talk to you about how that kind of matters. But I guess we should start with the news you probably care more about, which is, yesterday on the show, we talked about the Jalen Reagor trade and Ihmir Smith-Marsette getting cut as part of that, and kind of how flabbergasted I was. I was just as flabbergasted on the Minnesota Football Party, which you can, by the way, check out wherever you find your favorite podcasts, and also on YouTube. Just look up Locked On Minnesota Sports. But my confusion aside, the Vikings have their convictions, right? And they're going to go off of those. So the thing is, Ihmir Smith-Marsette got claimed by the Bears. So that one stings. It sucks because Smith-Marsette was kind of a fan favorite too. Like, people liked him. He seemed like a really beloved, one of those just like super likable guys. So it sucks to lose him, especially to a rival, because now we're contractually obligated to wish him ill, and that doesn't feel very good. But also, the Vikings have added to their practice squad. So they named their initial one on Wednesday, but we were too busy talking about the Jalen Reagor trade. So I'll catch you up on that. And then, really, they got a third practice squad QB. And Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah and Kevin O'Connell had a press conference. Not a lot said in it that you need to worry about, but there were some quotes on Mon and Mannion that were interesting. But the practice squad QB, I guess, is the most important thing because he's a quarterback. It's David Blau, star, beloved, tough guy on Hard Knocks, which I actually just got finished watching this week's episode. Dude gritted it out. What a king. David Blau is now QB3. Nick Mullins is QB2. Both of those guys are better than Mon and Mannion, I think. Blau is a little closer. Like, Blau feels like a little bit of a wash with those guys, but like, he's on the practice squad. We don't care that much. And you can hope, that he develops a little bit more than Mond had, right? That's the hope of hopes. And then, of course, you have Nick Mullins, who I think is far and away the best quarterback there. And none of these guys are good, right? But these are backups. So that situation has, I guess, resolved itself, and that's going to be it. But to recap with Kellen Mond, what a catastrophic draft pick, right? He's so bad his rookie year, and it wasn't all his fault. He got COVID. It messed with his body. It messed with his camp and stuff. So it was like, it's easy enough to give him a pass for his rookie year, but he was so bad that he couldn't go out in front of Sean Mannion. And I think he has taken a step forward this year, and the coaches seem to agree, like, he's improved over the course of camp. And Kevin O'Connell even said that much. And he still was not preferable to the Vikings over Sean Mannion. The Vikings tried to get Sean Mannion on their practice squad, and then when Sean Mannion decided to go to the Seahawks practice squad instead, and I believe he lives closer over there, so it was a close to home thing, they turned their eyes to Kellen Mond, who got claimed by the Browns, and also there was a waiver claim put in by the Eagles. So you weren't getting Kellen Mond back on your practice squad, but they wanted Sean Mannion first. And I want to go back to it wasn't Christmas, it was the second to last game of the year last year when Kirk Cousins had COVID and Sean Mannion played against the Packers. And somebody asked Zimmer, hey, why didn't Mon go in? Like, why didn't you want to see what he has? And Zimmer's answer, we all remember, was, well, I see him in practice every day. People made such a huge deal out of it. And I still think that what he was saying was like, well, I see him in practice. I don't need to use in-game live reps that count to evaluate Kellen Mond. I can evaluate him based on his practice tape. But it came off, and if he was saying this, he was right, that we see him in practice and therefore we know he sucks. And now you get a presser with a very similar question at Kevin O'Connell. And Kevin O'Connell said, I sat these two guys down and I said, you guys have to win this backup job, but it's not just a competition between you two. It's a competition between the possibility of me going out and getting somebody else, which is ultimately what happened. You have to beat that possibility too. And neither of them did. But the way O'Connell said it, and it's coach speak, right? Like, it's nice words with clearly like not nice meanings. But the way O'Connell said it was like, yeah, it wouldn't have been fair to ask him to be QB2, which is an evisceration. I mean, goodness, like that's like a Southern grandma saying, bless his heart. Like that's a rough thing to have said about you, even though like O'Connell was saying it out of like from a place of compassion about like, hey, yeah, no, like he is not ready to be a backup quarterback, and to ask him to be a backup quarterback would probably be too much pressure on him and would be worse for his development than him being, a third guy somewhere or being on a practice squad somewhere. It's funny, he is a backup quarterback now for the Browns, so the Browns disagreed, I guess. They're, one Jacoby Brissett injury away from Kellen Mond coming in, at least until Deshaun Watson comes back for them. But the idea that not only did Kellen Mond end this preseason not good enough to be a QB2, which I'm going to take my vindication there. I've been saying that all summer. But also that he improved a lot, and then still, like, where did he start from? My goodness. And thinking about where he could have started from, where Kevin O'Connell can both say he improved a bunch and also he isn't good enough to be a QB2, and thinking where he was, and then take whatever he did this spring, whatever he did in the offseason to get his body right and get better, whatever practice he did, take that off the plate too, and that's what Zimmer was working with in December. Yeah, no doy he didn't put that dude on the field. He was right to. I said then that he was right to. I got a ton of flack for it, so you all owe me an apology. I hope Kellen Mond turns it around. I mean, he seems like a really studious kid. Like, he's really like a hard worker, nose down kind of guy. He's been first on the practice field more than once. He puts in the work and the effort, and it's just a matter of, does he have that kind of innate feel for the rhythm of the game? And the pacing has always been his biggest problem. If you're a Browns fan listening to this, his problem is that the ball comes out late, and that it's either late through his reads or he just doesn't have that rhythm down. It's almost like the musical part of the game that he doesn't have now down, because he knows what he's looking at, but it's just late. And it's a little hesitant, and there's confidence, and maybe a fresh start is good for him, and I hope he turns it around. He seems like a really great kid. As for Sean Mannion, he just goes over to Seattle, and I guess he can help Geno Smith on the whiteboard, I suppose. I still think Sean Mannion, I hope he joins the coaching ranks, because it seems like everybody says he's going to be a really good coach, and he could take the Kevin O'Connell route, right? And kind of fast track himself from that backup quarterback role. But that is what backup quarterbacks do. I mean, throughout the week, backup quarterbacks aren't taking reps. They're doing whiteboard stuff. They're helping the quarterback prepare. They're doing game plan things. They're kicking around ideas in the quarterback room and going, what if they give you this coverage? What if it rolls this way and stuff? That's what Mannion did for Cousins for all those years. Now he'll do that for Geno, and I hope he does well too. But now we have Nick Mullins doing that. And Nick Mullins is a very preparatory guy. I think he's going to find some chemistry with Kirk Cousins in that way. They're both very much like type A preparers, really like study hard for the test kind of guys. And I don't know much about David Blau outside of what you can learn from Hard Knocks. But that's the room now. So the rest of the practice squad is out. And also, I just want to talk about what the practice squad is for and how you can expect to see these guys used. The sort of why this matters part of the conversation. But I'm going to tell you right now, none of this changes the betting lines. So you can go right now and you can go to betonline.net and gamble on the Vikings. You can gamble on their win total. I think it's up to 9.5 now. There's a lot of hype on the Vikings. So if you thought that they would be like a 9-win team and you weren't really sure, well, that what wasn't over just became an under. You can also bet on where they'll finish in the division. Not only will they win the division, but what if you think they'll place second? You can bet on that. Or third or fourth. You can bet on over-unders for player props. You like how many sacks Danielle Hunter will have or how many yards Justin Jefferson will have. You can grab on all of that stuff and other sports as well. You can bet on baseball or basketball or whatever. So you can find all that stuff at betonline.net. You can also build weird, wacky player props when the games actually start. You can bet right in the middle of a game or an event with their live betting module. It's all super great. Again, that is betonline.net, where the game starts. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. For your second listen, you can actually start listening to the ultimate NFL preview, the ultimate pro football preview. You can find that on Odyssey. It started coming out this week. And you can find it on its own separate podcast feed, but it is like an ultimate preview. All of us in the Locked On NFL Network, as well as the Odyssey experts, breaking down and previewing the season for you. Again, check that out at Odyssey or wherever you find your favorite podcast. It's a separate feed. Just search it out. Ultimate Pro Football Preview. Also, check out the History Doc. If you are a patron of mine, patreon.com/LukeBraunNFL, today you can watch the 6th episode that covers the 2000s, all the way from 2041 Donut going all the way to when the dome collapses in 2010. That includes, all the end of Randy Moss, the last few years of him, Dante Culpepper, going all the way through to the Brad Childress era and Tavares Jackson and Favre. It's a very tonally weird one. There's some really sad stuff in there and some really serious stuff, and then some very, very stupidly unserious stuff. Again, you can find that at patreon.com/LukeBraunNFL. Okay, so rest of the practice squad. We have David Blau. They also added a couple of players that weren't in their initial practice squad. So they're up to 15 players now. They added Travis Toivonen. He is an undrafted guy, and Tay Gowan, who was a Philadelphia Eagles practice squad guy, a cornerback. Travis Toivonen's a big, tall, red zone kind of guy, and he was a fan-controlled football league stud. So we got like the 7-on-7 league where you can call the plays on Twitch TV, which is actually pretty fun. I did it for the first year. Anyways, he's on there. And then the Vikings have the 12 that they originally signed to their practice squad, who are Dan Chisena and Miles Dorn. And then Perry Nickerson. I think those three are the ones you're going to see activated the most right away. And then Kyle Hinton, Tristan Jackson, Bryant Kobach, William Quenku, Nick Muse, Janarius Robinson, TJ Smith, Josh Sokol, and Jalen Twyman. A little bit of everything there. There's not a lot to take away, of course, from like who makes the practice squad, but really what you're looking for here is special teams and then who is going to be available to activate at a moment's notice. So Perry Nickerson's a really important one here. Because the Vikings currently do not have anybody outside of Chandon Sullivan on the roster as a nickel corner. So if Sullivan goes down, they don't have another nickel that comes in and plays. They're going 3 safety probably to do that, which was my guess from the kind of the whole off season, but now they're in that. But they have Perry Nickerson on the practice squad. So, there's a decent chance Perry Nickerson is just active anyways, and you got him like gunning punts or covering punts or kickoffs. But if you don't have him active and Chandon Sullivan goes down, now he's right there and in the building and you can kind of elevate him. I actually asked on the Minnesota football party, we had Ron Johnson in, and I asked him, I was like, is there a huge difference between being on the active roster and on the practice squad in terms of like your day-to-day responsibilities and like your experience? And he basically said like, no, I mean like you're in the room and you're practicing. Like whether or not you're in the practice squad is really, it's just if you have a different set of rules on if you can go sign with another team. And that's all the practice squad really is, Perry Nickerson can go sign with a team if they want him on the 53-man roster, but he can actually just like screw off and go to another practice squad too. But that doesn't functionally change what he's doing in the room. So if he's on the 53 or he's on the backup, he's still the backup nickel. And you can kind of say he won that job over Nate Hairston, who ended up going somewhere else. A lot of Viking players actually got claimed or ended up on other practice squads. I digress. So what you might see is something like Chisena and Dorn elevated to be players 54 and 55 week 1. That would be, I guess, my guess. But that what that means is every player for 3 weeks of the season. You can do this 3 times before it's basically, okay, by game 4, just put the dude on the roster. But you can activate a player 3 different times throughout the season from your practice squad. It's a holdover from the COVID days, and people really liked it and having the extra depth, so they just kept it. So Dan Chisena can play week 1, 2, and 3, be functionally on the team, no difference. And then by then, if somebody's on IR, if somebody's there, if a roster spot opens up, you could see these guys on the team at some point. Now, some of these guys, Janaris Robinson, Jalen Twyman, I kind of think Kyle Hinton a little bit, Tristan Jackson a little bit, Nick Muse. Some of those guys feel a little bit more like they're just a stash. That it's just like, okay, be in the building, come learn. We'll come, we'll see if you can make the team again next summer. But some of these guys, like more veteran presences, like TJ Smith, who actually did appear in a game last year, guys like Perry Nickerson and Miles Dorn and Dan Chisena, feel like they are there to be sort of like players 54 to 57 on the actual roster. And that they will be like elevated throughout the season. You can elevate 2 players a week, so you can't elevate all these guys all the time, but you can have just those 2. I know that's like a lot of minutia about like how it works, but it is sort of changing the way that like roster construction is approached here, because before you really had your 53 and that was it. And the practice squad was sort of an afterthought of like, all right, we made our cuts. Let's see who we can get back in the building. Right. But now that practice squad is kind of functionally part of your roster. They've got now, if Kirk Cousins, God forbid, has an ankle injury and goes down, they've got QB2 in the building, and they don't even need to use a roster spot on him. Let's say Kirk Cousins has an injury, he's out 2 weeks, right? Nick Mullins has to play 2 weeks. Well, David Blau can just be active for those 2 weeks, and you don't even have to use a roster spot on it. And that changes a whole bunch cap-wise as well. You don't need to sign somebody for an entire year deal. You just have to pay that practice squad player 2 weeks worth of being on an active roster. That has impacts on who you keep. It allows you to do stuff like, look, the best 6 corners made the team, and we didn't have to force Perry Nickerson on there just to have a backup slot, because we know that Perry Nickerson can be on the practice squad. And if he does get poached and somebody else puts him on their roster, great, we can get somebody else to be the backup slot that goes on the practice squad. And because we also have this really good room of safeties, we know that somebody can fill in and kind of limp you to the end of the game if Chandon Sullivan goes down. And it gives you a lot more freedom and flexibility. And what Spielman would do, and I wonder if Kwesi's going to do the same thing, what Spielman would always do, it was sort of a risky way to live, but he would, like, you might remember Jack Tocho being like cut and re-signed like 7 times in a season. He would bounce up and down the roster, and other guys would kind of come in and out depending on the injury or what they needed, or if they need a little extra depth that week. And it sort of, he was like player 54 on the roster, and he was in it and out of it so often that you could kind of put him in the room and say, hey, we're just going to kind of cut you and re-sign you all year. You're here. You're going to be on the practice squad or on the active roster. It won't change anything for you. You just put your head down and go to work, and we're just going to work with your agent to do stuff on and off, and you'll get half a season's worth of pay, and you'll go, okay, I'm happy with that. There's nothing more than a handshake, though, that stops Jack Tocho from eventually going and signing someone else, which, if I remember, is exactly what happened. Eventually, one of those cuts happened, and he got a call from somebody that said, hey, we'll just put you on our roster. We won't mess with it. And he goes, okay, I'll take that. And so you kind of live a little dangerously, but you risk them going off and signing with someone else. But if you can convince them not to, if you can say, hey, we're just going to, we're going to have you on and off the roster, but really you're on the team. And if you can convince them that functionally they're on the team, and it's just a matter of you're going to get half a year's worth of pay, but that's better than being on somebody else's practice squad. If you can get that dynamic to work and nobody else goes and picks that guy up and puts them on their real roster, you just kind of got an extra roster spot for nothing. And Spielman would do this all the time. Guys would be on and off there every week. There'd be some weird transaction about some guy you've never heard of that's suddenly, player 53 on the Vikings, and here he is. He made a special teams tackle, and who's number 68, So, all right. I have made you sit through enough practice squad minutia, and that's all there really is to say about that. There's your practice squad, there's how it works, and there's kind of why it's going to work that way. So as a reward, let's go over a passing concept. That this is great. So Sean Syed, who I had on the show, a couple weeks ago is now writing at Daily Norseman about the Vikings scheme, and he's sounds like he's going to try to write weekly about the Viking scheme. Very, very excited about that, and I want to go over one of the things that he wrote about, a past concept called Swab and what it is and why it's important, and how it angles to get a wide receiver open, and this is very much a kind of manufacture a matchup kind of thing. And then maybe even talk a little bit about how it pairs with the run. So the concept that I want to talk about is called Swab, or water, I guess, if you're a Shanahan guy, but we'll go with Swab because we're McVay people here now. So that is a basic, or you might know it as a dig, but an intermediate route somewhere 12-ish, 15-ish yards, that cuts inward, and then a shallow cross of some sort. And there are variants in which it is, if it's, 5-yard depth or a 10-yard depth, or if it's got an angle, or if it's looking for a zone or more of a search route or whatever. But really, the basic, no pun intended, the fundamental of this concept is a high-low. A lot of these are. And what that means is at some point, the in-breaking dig and the shallow cross coming across the other side are going to meet. And eventually, they will be on top of each other. That will be in someone's zone, hopefully. Or if it's man, you just hope these guys get open, right? But that will be in somebody's zone, and that person will have to decide if they are covering the shallow or not. And or if they're covering the deep, right? And whichever one they don't have, you throw to. So, a few things to understand about Swab. A, it is usually run out of 3-by-1 formations. So you have 3 receivers on one side and 1 on the other, and a lot of times it'll come out of a bunch. The Vikings are going to use a lot of bunches this year. They're going to live in the bunch. And part of the advantage of that is, A, it makes it easier for wide receivers to block in the run, right? So your run plays can be a little more successful. But beyond that, it's it really stresses the coverage rules when everybody starts in the same place, Whose zone is that? Who's the outside, inside? How do you do that? Defenses all have different rules for how to do that, but they're a little harder to execute, and you can hopefully encourage mistakes. But the fun doesn't end there. So the shallow from the Swab will usually be one of those guys coming out of that bunch. And again, depending on the variation, it changes who does what, who's in the matchup, who are you doing this for. That's all choices you can make week to week, even play to play. But you have somebody from that bunch coming all the way across the formation. And then you have somebody who's usually the one in the 3-by-1, the backside guy, who's just running that dig. A lot of times that guy will be like Justin Jefferson. There's a really great way to get the ball to Justin Jefferson. Anytime 3-by-1, put the good player on the backside and make him the one, right? The Packers did this with Devontae Adams. Raiders probably will too. But think about who the read is on that play. That linebacker, usually on the weak side, with fewer players, is going to be the guy who's dealing with this, right? Because the shallow is going to come into his zone at the same time the dig breaks. Ideally, that's how you draw it up. And so that's going to be the guy you're really reading. Now, what are his rules? And you kind of have to know a little bit about defense to know this. But if you think about like Zimmer rules for him, which is what I'm still most familiar with because that's what I studied for the last, 8 years. But so using like a Zimmer rule, you'll have something like a push call or any kind of zone match. There is going to be some way for a defense in like most coverages, unless it is pure straight up man-to-man, which you got to have some cojones to run that. Not all defenses will have the horses for it. Otherwise, you'll have some way for linebackers to pass off that shallow cross. You will very rarely be asking for a linebacker to just cover that guy, especially out of a bunch. Because what if that guy is, even Jalen Reagor? Or what if that guy is KJ Osborne or Thielen or Jefferson? Are you putting a linebacker on those guys? Because they're faster than your linebacker, and they're not going to be able to keep up all the way across the field, and you're going to be able to find not only a completion, but there's a chance that guy can turn upfield because he's so much faster, and now it suddenly becomes an explosive. So that linebacker is probably going to have some kind of pass-off rule. And a lot of times that pass-off rule is if you see somebody coming shallow over to your side, you pick them up. A lot of times the hook defender has that alert in his coverage that, hey, if somebody's coming at you, you pick them up. and the nickel or the other linebacker or whoever is going to pass him off to you. Again, depends on the coverage, but a lot of times that's going to be that. And so the genius of the McVay system, and this is the real thing that I want you to take away from Swab, is that the low in the high low, the shorter route is very often designed to trigger some coverage rule and push some button in their coverage that makes the defender choose low. These guys aren't picking on the fly. They're not just making judgment calls. They are taught, hey, if you see that you're in a stretch, if you're getting high load, always pick the high. They're taught that, but then they're also taught coverage rules. And if you can make those coverage rules conflict with, hey, pick high or, pick the high if you're in a high low, if you can make coverage rules conflict with that directive, you can at best trick the guy into taking the low so that you can hit a dig over the top and get a nice 15-yard completion to Justin Jefferson. And at least that, and at best, get the guy to be confused and totally bust it. And that's when you can get even bigger plays. If that linebacker does the right thing, like worst case scenario, that linebacker sees the play, recognizes it, backs off to the dig to Justin Jefferson, well, now you've got a shallow cross with a wide receiver on probably a linebacker. That's a great matchup. That's the worst it can get? Heck yeah. That's the point of Swab. Obviously, if your quarterback doesn't see that the linebacker backed off, he could easily throw an interception here, but you kind of got to hope your guy can read that, right? That is what's exciting about it. And usually Swab will pair with some 3-receiver concept on the front side. So you'll have the other 2 guys in the bunch and say like the running back runs out and is allowed you to do whatever you want over there. It can be a flood. It can be something else. It can be, a bow concept, some flag or something. Like you can pair it with whatever, right? Usually something that will be like, if you're worried about true man coverage on Swab, you can put a man beater over there or something, right? And that's where you really start the fun play design stuff starts to come in with that. But all in all, the cool point of Swab is that it puts that linebacker in a really, really difficult position. And if I remember, Eric Kendricks got one of the coolest interceptions I've ever seen on Matt Stafford a couple years ago on a concept like this. I'd have to go back and watch and make sure that it was the concept, but it was a read like this where it was a high-low read, and Kendricks just slow played it. He stayed low. Stafford thought he had it, and then Kendricks backed off and was way more in the window than Stafford thought, and he got an interception off of it. It was a really cool play. It might have been Goff, and I remember it being the Lions, but I can't remember the specifics. At any rate, that's kind of how you have to play it on defense. And of course, defense, some coverages will do better against that than others. Some coverages will have great pass-off rules, and also they'll have a safety coming down to help with the dig, and something, will work out there. And that's why you have to have something on the other side that beats that kind of coverage. And this is where coaching gets really hard, right? But there's a concept. I'm hopefully throughout the season, and especially this coming week when we don't have any games to break down, but we're sort of in season mode, I'm going to go over concepts like this and try to just get you to understand the principles behind them. You don't need to remember it's a shallow cross with a dig and about 10 yards and 15, and the Z does that. You don't need to remember all that. Just remember that this is meant to force, and when I say force, I mean, you know that linebacker is looking for a signal, and you want to give him that signal to pick up the cross. And if you can do that, then you've gotten him out of the equation, and that dig should be open if the receiver can run a route. That's why you put Justin Jefferson back there. He's okay at those. Next week, we'll go over whatever news, but then the season really starts. So we'll have a couple more off-season-y ones, more season preview kind of stuff. And then Thursday will be crossover Thursday, so I will talk to Peter Bukowski of Locked On Packers. I will do my best to annoy and anger him. That's always the goal of Locked On Packers crossover week. And then we'll do some more Packer preview stuff on Friday, maybe even Wednesday. That's going to be how it goes. And then we'll be in the in-season cadence. We're here, folks. Meaningful football. It's right around the corner. I'm super excited. I'll see y'all then. And as always, Skol.